Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining us from. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today. Welcome. Folks on Facebook as well, joining us virtually from multiple spaces. Welcome. I am Penel Ibe, and I'm the Policy Engagement Coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee's National Office of Public Policy and Advocacy, or AFSC OPA for short. In case you're wondering, you are in the right place. This is the timely conversation breaking open cages from the ground up, where we'll be talking about, we'll be having conversations with AFSC staff and my dear colleagues who have been and continue to do work on campaigns to end detention around the United States. While we're just, let's get to know each other first. So please, both on Facebook and here in Zoom, share your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. And let's do one quick icebreaker in the spirit of summer. So you can share your name, where you're joining us in the chat, and what's your go-to ice cream flavor for summer. So like I said, I'm Penel. I'm Policy Engagement Coordinator with AFSC. I'm joining you from a very gloomy, almost rainy DC today. And my ice cream flavor of the summer is anything with cardamom and ginger in it. So I'd love to see, let's just get to know each other briefly, where you're joining us from the chat, joining us in the chat, and hi to folks on Facebook as well. I'm seeing some folks joining us from California, from New Orleans, someone saying they love mango ice cream. I love everything mango too, I definitely agree. The Superman flavor, really colorful. Appreciate that. So let's just, populate the chat, say hi to each other. If you see somebody maybe somebody from your community network as well, just say hi to them. Find the opportunity to just connect, even though we are virtual at this moment. Um, and while we're doing that, I'm just going to share briefly some community engagement. Since this is not too much of an interactive meeting, but more of a webinar style panel, we encourage you to use the chat to engage as you are right now, but please try not to distract from the speakers and the conversation that's going on. Use that to, add in comments to reflect on what you've heard, but keep in mind that other folks might be paying attention to the speakers. Seek collective learning, so be open and ask questions in that space. If you're speaking or sharing, speak your truth, share your truth, use I statements, do not speak on behalf of others. Also consider your privilege, your language privilege. For one, I speaking in English will have to remind myself to speak slower. Also your privilege of what community you come from, your access to conversations that we'll be talking about today, um, and more. And, if you think of any other community agreements that you would like to contribute to this learning environment, please go ahead and type them in the chat as well. Things like step up, step back, allow others to speak, making sure that everyone is welcome into the space that we are curating today. So just looking through the chat now and seeing tamarindo ice cream, blackberry ice cream. We have a host of flavors here today. This is super exciting, just to know. And I hope you all are actually enjoying the summer. I know it is hot, across the country. A lot of communities is facing terrible heat numbers. And so we're just standing in solidarity and keeping them in our minds at the moment as we do this work and as we have these conversations as well. So as if folks are just joining us for the first time, and I mean us by AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, if you're not sure who this organization is, we're, I think, about 107 years old. So we're pretty old, a faith-based organization grounded in Quaker belief and in the dignity and worth of every person. With regards to our work with immigrant communities and on immigration or migration generally, we provide direct legal services and accompany immigrant communities and migrant communities, both in the region, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, around that area, and within the United States as well. We accompany them in moments of movement building, in policy advocacy, and just with whatever the community needs at that moment. We directly support needs, aspirations of these communities, and make sure that we are standing alongside them and taking their leadership, when we can, of what they want, to see, to come to fruition in their community. The concerns we raise, the policies we advocate for, the voices we amplify are all grounded in these collaborations with impacted communities. And we're grateful, for the relationships we've built over time, for the trust we've built over time, and we're committed to doing this work as well. And so with that, I will pass it on now to a key community leader who also herself is directly impacted by the systems and structures that we'll be discussing today, the detention system in the United States. Leticia Sierra is going to open up this space, grounding us in the reality of what we're facing, grounding us in the stories across the US of millions of people who have come in contact with the detention system. So Leticia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Leticia. I am 37 years old and I am from San Diego, California. I am originally from Mexico, and actually last year of 2021, on February, I was detained and taken to Otay Mesa Detention Center. When I got there, it was very poor conditions. It was a very scary situation because when I got there, COVID-19 had just started. And it was very scary and very difficult situation because they didn't have a lot of cleaning supplies that was gonna help us sanitize the place, and also helping us not to spread the disease around. So when I got there, a lot of the girls that were there, they were getting very sick. A lot of them were vomiting, having a lot of the symptoms, um, uh, headaches, a lot of the symptoms that people have when they're getting coronavirus. And so another thing besides not having cleaning supplies is also like the medical assistance was like really poor. You had to put yourselves on the list a day before in order for you to see a doctor or a nurse that were there. And if you were feeling sick, the only things that they did have or provided for us, it was ibuprofen, which ibuprofen was just didn't do anything. And so um, being there was very scary. I have a child, I have a family. I've been living here in San Diego since I was 6 years old, and I'm 37. And I was so scared for my life. I thought I was gonna die in there. There was, I even got myself sick a couple of times, and I tried to get medical assistance, and they just wouldn't be able to provide medical assistance because they said that I didn't have a lot of the symptoms that we were supposed to have in order to get medical assistance. A lot of these girls were taken away to another place inside the detention center. Um, they were very sick. A lot of the girls, they were bringing them back into our units, into our rooms, and we were all in the same room. There were about 8 girls in one room, and have in mind that in this place there were about 16 rooms and 18 beds in each room. So I honestly thought that I wasn't going to be able to make it alive from that place. It was hard also communicating with family. That was another issue as well. You could only use phones for a certain time. Thank God that I was able to communicate with my family, and I told them what was going on inside the detention center. So they were the ones that were helping us communicate with some of the organizations that were helping us get the help that we needed. So while we were there, we wrote a whole bunch of letters trying to get help from the outside, trying to let them know exactly what was going on, because we were watching the news and we were seeing that a lot of stories were being made that they had supplies for us, that we had all types of things inside the detention centers to help us, but it was a total lie. They wouldn't even give us face masks. There was a time that we had to make our own face mask with the shirts that we had, that we were wearing at the detention center. And so thank God that we were able to get help from a lot of the organizations that were outside. They were helping with money. They were trying to help us get the masks for us, which we've never got them. And I believe that a lot of the people from outside, they should know and they should be aware of what really is going on inside these detention centers, because it's a very critical situation. A lot of people are losing their lives in this place. They're going crazy. I it's so sad that because of a piece of paper, because of a piece of document that we don't have that says that we're legal, we're being treated this way, that we're being detained, we're being taken away from our families, from our lives, you know, and it's very unhuman-like. And so I just want to get the point across and tell other people that we're not criminals. We're just human, just like everyone else. We have families here. We have jobs. We're trying to better our lives here. And a lot of people think that we're criminals, but we're not. We're not criminals. The only, I guess, criminal thing is that we're not from this country. And hopefully, by all these things that we're doing, we're gonna be able to help everyone that's still in there, because it is not a safe place for people to be inside these detention centers. The food is horrible, medical assistance is poor. Like I said, they don't have cleaning supplies. A lot of these people are racist inside these detention centers. We've been humiliated at these places. Like I said, separated from our families. And I hope that this message goes to everyone, and for them to let them know how important it is to free our people from these places. They don't deserve this. They don't deserve what's happening to them. When you're inside these places, you don't really get any help. You can't even get in contact with any lawyers, with your family sometimes, and you can't really get any help while you're inside the place. I feel like it's a setup for people to get deported. And I'm just so glad and so thankful that I was able to get out of that place. I just want to thank like the organizations, because they were the ones that really did all the hard work to help us and take us out of those places.
Thank you so much, Leticia, for sharing your experience. I know living such an experience is never easy. And as you can see in the chat, folks are also just thanking you for being, vulnerable with us in this space, letting us know what really you experienced there. And we're grateful to have you here with us. And, just keeping in mind other folks who have not had the opportunity to also be outside of these detention centers. So, folks, just little word of encouragement. In the chat for Leticia, who will also be heading off to class real shortly. So she really just took a quick time to come share with us today, and we're grateful for that. And so next, we're going to do a quick poll. We want to know who's in the room. Right now, there's about 80 something folks here. And we want to know, where are you coming from to this anti-detention conversation? How familiar are you with what we're talking about today? Is this the first time for you? Are you seasoned in this? Is this like the rodeo you always go to? So we're going to do a brief poll, and I think everyone should be able to see that on their screen shortly. And it's also in Spanish for folks who need that interpretation as well. And so just let us know, what is your level of engagement in anti-detention campaigns? And if you're co-hosts or hosts on the Zoom link, you're not supposed to click on this because you'll end the polling by mistake. So don't ruin the fun for everybody else. But we want to know, what is your level of engagement? You've never taken action to end detention yet. This is your first time. That's cool. You've joined a rally, a vigil, a protest against detention in your community. That's also something we want to know. You've signed a petition, or you've written to a member of Congress about detention. That's something else. You're an active participant in some way or the other. You volunteer, you offer legal services, you offer accompaniment to people who are going for ICE check-ins, maybe. Like, what is your level of familiarity with this process? We'll just give it about 10 more seconds. So folks, we have about 70 something percent of folks have voted. So this is a good number. Let's see how many more people, but just for the final 30% of folks. All right, and our poll is closed. So can you all see the poll results? You see how everybody fared on this? So 41% of you are active participants or organizers in community efforts against detention. So this is good. You know, it's great that we have that community present here, and we definitely will be looking to you to just, you know, add in a little anecdotal information in the chat about like, oh yes, I agree, we experienced something similar in a community, or wow, this is something new that I haven't thought about in my own anti-detention work. 31% of you have signed a petition or written to your member of Congress about detention. This is super important because as we're doing work, we need to make sure that our elected officials at every level know what's going on, are hearing stories from our communities so that we can hold them accountable when they do not act in favor of what the community wants. 17% of you have joined a rally or a vigil or a protest against detention, standing in solidarity with people who are in detention. Putting your body out there on the line is an important act of solidarity and accompaniment. As a Quaker-based organization, this is something that we practice a lot and something that we encourage people to do. Various forms of accompaniment as standing in solidarity with impacted community members. And 10% of you have never taken any action to end detention yet. This is the space for you. You are welcome here. We're going to talk about these things, what it looked like for some of my colleagues who started this work 20 years ago. What was the level of knowledge then versus now? You know, everything starts with a little step. And so if there are any questions at any point in time that you think you would like to know, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to make sure that our panelist addresses the questions. Sounds good? Awesome. Thanks, Kalik, for running the poll. And we are gonna go ahead now into our panel conversation. So while you're joining us today, what we had advertised this as, and it hasn't changed yet, is a conversation with AFSC staff, my dear colleagues who've been doing this work for decades, for some now, who've been running anti-detention campaigns in their community, as well as engaging in national efforts. We'll be hearing today from a colleague, Pedro Rios, from our US-Mexico border program in San Diego. We'll be hearing from Serge Demafak and Jordan, both colleagues of mine from the AFSC Newark office. Jordan is an attorney and Serge is a director of our ICE anti-detention, end detention and deportation programs. And we'll also be joined by Jennifer Piper, our director of the AFSC Colorado office program at the moment. And I think that's the panel for today. Yes, anybody missing? Anybody want to join? Any takers? You feel like you can hang with this, folks? If not, we're going to keep moving. Thank you all so much for being willing to share this space. So excited, so super excited to hear from you all, as I will also be learning for folks who most of my organizing or advocacy within AFSC is working on the Citizenship for All campaign. And so very rarely am I able to sort of learn and listen in on what goes on in the different states and in the anti-detention campaigns that they are running. So this is a space that I'm excited to engage in as well. So what we're first going to do is we're going to hear from our panelists, and we're going to go one after the other to hear from them, obviously their names, their jobs, just a repeat of their jobs, where they are. And we want to hear what detention center is nearest to them that they're actively campaigning to close, or are supporting people who are currently detained in that detention center, and any other detention, sort of anti-detention policy that they may be advocating against at the moment. So or advocating for, sorry, if it's an anti-detention policy, words. So we're just gonna hear briefly from them, and we'll go ahead and get started with Jordan. Jordan, do you wanna let us know a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Jordan Weiner. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. I'm an immigration attorney and I work in AFSC's Newark office in the Immigrant Rights Program. And I represent people detained at Elizabeth Detention Center and Essex County Correctional Facility in New Jersey.
Thanks, Jordan. Sorry, I was like Elizabeth. Thanks, Jordan. Next, we're gonna hear from Jennifer Piper. Are you unable to unmute? We will get that sorted shortly.
Okay. Now that I can unmute, I can let you know that my name is Jennifer Piper. I work here in Denver, Colorado, on one of the campaigns that I've been working on since I joined AFSC in 2008 is closing the GEO for-profit detention center in Aurora, Colorado, right next door to us. a facility that grew from 500 to 1,500 beds, and that we're working to shrink out of existence. And right now we're looking forward to seeing what we can do at the state level to keep them from being able to renew their contract in coming years.
Thanks, Piper, for sharing. We're going to hear from Serge now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Serge Demefak. I am the In-Detention Deportation Project Coordinator of our Newark office. I'm in New Jersey. We're currently in New Jersey trying to end detention in all the 4 jails that are in our state. And we have an active work going on with obviously the private jail that's here, Elizabeth, and the 4 other community jails or county jails that are around. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Serge. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Pedro.
Hi, everyone. Hi, friends. My name is Pedro Rios, and I'm director of AFSC's US-Mexico Border Program, which is located in San Diego. And together with the Free Them All San Diego Coalition, our work is to strive to close the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is run by Core Civic.
Thanks for sharing, Pedro. So yes, we see detention centers across the board, random places in the US, all around the US, and multiple campaigns that are going on there. Some of the colleagues that are not represented here today are our colleagues in New Hampshire who are also doing work, as well as in Oregon, in Florida, and North Carolina as well. You know, folks who are engaging with communities who are in detention center at the moment and trying to get their releases and shut down such spaces. So we'll go ahead and get started. But before we get into the gist of detention, anti-detention campaigning, I'd like to hear from you, Piper. Let's start with you, Piper. At AFSC, we have called for an end to detention and deportation. And oftentimes I'm asked, you know, when I share this with folks, you know, reporters, other people, why does AFSC have this stance? Can you reflect on the stance to call for an end to detention and deportation? And if you notice, there's no exception to the rule, right? So can you share a little bit about why this is the North Star for all of our campaigns?
Yeah, we really believe at AFSC that no person should be detained or deported. In part, going back to our human rights framework under which we started, we believe that freedom of movement is a human right, and that our immigration policies should protect that right and recognize and incorporate civil and human rights standards within our borders and within our policies of migration. And what we know, and Leticia alluded to this, is that a lot of our immigration system criminalizes people. The way we talk about immigrants is designed to dehumanize them. And when we do that, we don't really think about what detention and deportation actually mean for our communities, for them, and for their loved ones in terms of suffering, separation of families, loss of community and work. All of those things are really extreme consequences for lacking a piece of paper that we deny people. And Leticia also alluded to that at the beginning. So what we want to see is that that we change the migration policies that are punishing people. Instead of punishing folks for their movement across the globe, which is now at historically high levels, we should instead be looking at how do we make and protect the people who are coming? How do we make their human rights a reality, no matter where they are on the globe, and protect them with our policies? And then lastly, profiting from people's pain is never okay. And we're going to be talking more about how our detention system takes our tax dollars and turns it into profit for a small percentage of people while causing so much pain across our system. So I think those are the main reasons that come up for me when I talk about it. I'm sure the other panelists have other reasons that come up for them too.
Thanks, Piper. Any other panelists want to share? Maybe Pedro, do you want to chime in, see what this means, especially in your community as well?
I think Jennifer covered it well, but jumping on that last point of the profit margin, And oftentimes I think what contributes to that as well is the ability for the United States to dehumanize people to the degree where it's acceptable to cage people up, and where the death of people who are caged up is tolerable. And so we certainly saw different degrees of this over the past several years, especially with children who died under Border Patrol custody that were detained in these facilities that were meant to be short-term facilities, but really where children were being held for an egregious amount of time beyond the 72 hours that were permitted under the law. And so what we tend to see in scenarios where people are detained is where states and those that operate under the authority by the states, so private actors, will commonly violate people's very basic human rights in such an egregious way, where even the language that's used to describe them is horrendous. And so I've had conversations with people who have told me that Border Patrol agents will regularly use degrading language when speaking to them, language that then makes it acceptable in their mindset to use abusive practices that could then lend to situations where there is loss of life. And we will talk about that in a short while, especially around how the pandemic was treated in situations where people were denied very basic equipment to prevent the transfer of disease from one person to another, as Leticia described in her opening statement.
Thanks, Pedro, for adding that nuance there. I think, like you said, you start dehumanizing the person and you're able to then justify caging them and justify making money on top of them. And this just invokes, you know, sort of the narrative of chattel slavery and things we've seen in the history of this country and beyond. I was doing some research and learned that the history of mass detention really came about when a lot of Haitian nationals were fleeing, you know, dictatorship, right? And they were mass detained, and the policy did not require mass detention at that time, but to justify why they were only detaining Haitians, the policy was then changed. And I mean, it's no shocker, right? Like just within yesterday, I think, you know, the head of DHS was also saying that nationals from Cuba and Haiti who are fleeing terrible conditions should not arrive in the US or they will be detained. And so we're just seeing history repeat itself because these systems transcend time, because they're rooted in the same cause of dehumanizing whoever the person is, and ignoring the real reason why people are migrating. So, you know, we've talked about the fact that it's not today. This is long-term work. We've been seeing these trends for a long while. And in collaboration with our partners, our community members, impacted individuals themselves, we have long advocated for due process and humane conditions for these detainees, people in detention centers, while shining a light on the rampant abuses, you know, that occur there, like Pedro alluded to. This work has had some humble beginnings. You know, we didn't just have a full-blown campaign one day. There were days of humble learnings and organizing where it's 2 people in the meeting space, 3 people in the meeting space before we got to a space where we're having hundreds of people at a rally, or even having the demands that we've made of Congress or the administration be part of a potential president's campaign plan, for example. So Serge, do you want to share briefly on the journey thus far, you know, doing advocacy in Newark, New Jersey, and just highlighting the value of that consistent advocacy that you've done that is rooted and developed in the partnership with immigrant communities?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pernille. You're asking a very critical question here. You know, if you know a little bit about the history of how our office in New Jersey started, it was basically one legal staff and one organizer. And today we've grown, you know, we have more than 30 other staff and many lawyers, Jordan here being one of them. So it's a process that was very incremental. It just occurred over the past more than 20 years. And over my time at AFSC, I've seen, you know, some of our basic work grow and reach, you know, some very important milestones. I'm going to give you some examples. You know, when I first joined FSC about 5 years ago, you know, some of our work was not really engaging directly with the local authorities because, as Piper mentioned, our local governments are very important into diverting resources that they can use to build a community and using it to, you know, crush our community members. And, you know, we suddenly realized that we had to make some more effort, gather data, use the capacity of our lawyers who are attending, who are going to jail, because we had increasingly more attorneys, to document what was happening within the jails. And they use that as a tool to actually, confront ICE with facts, with cases, to confront state authority, to confront our county authorities, to confront our county appointees. So we have to learn to become people who can speak with facts. And you don't do that with two staff. You do that being steady and documenting whatever happens with you and working in coalitions. And we've developed coalitions over time and also nurture new ones and contribute to create other organizations that are helping us today build a broader movement. And I think getting to the stage where we have a movement, where in New Jersey, we can say New Jersey folks and New York folks and people in other part of the country, we are working now as a movement. It's something that I am so proud to say that we've worked together hand in hand. Some of the key milestones, for example, we managed to have what we call the Immigrant Trust Directive, passed. That was and be adopted in 2018. When the new governor, who was Democrat, took power. That was a big achievement. And currently, we are trying to turn that trust directive into what we call a Values Act. That is actually going to become a law, because we realize that the higher the position within the ranking of our state norms, they're going to be stronger in being implemented. And these are things that we are learning along the way, because we can see how people are trying to skirt the system that we're trying to develop. We've now had more access in our jail system. Now we are able to attend very key meetings where the situation in jails are occurring. This is something that we were not able to do 5 years ago, or just 3 years ago, or 4 years ago. Now we're able to sit at the table and say, this is one situation, we have this case, this had to stop, and confront the system and ask them direct questions. And we've had other cases. For example, right now we just passed a law which is yet to be signed by the governor. And this law, which is a state law, that's going to basically stop all jails in New Jersey, all private facilities, to enter into an agreement with ICE, in particular renewing agreements or extend the agreements. So we are trying to really put in place a system. And I say all that has been done working with other community members, working in coalitions. And it's been a long road, but rewarding to see where we've been and what we're achieving right now.
Thanks, Serge, for sharing that. Piper, I know in Colorado as well, I think it's about a decade plus now of organizing, like you said, to close the GEO Detention Center. Do you want to also share about, the journey thus far?
Yeah, we actually started advocating against the detention center when the corporation wanted to expand the number of beds. So before that, our small but mighty immigrant rights movement in Colorado really didn't know anything about detention. When people were picked up by ICE, it was like they went into a black hole, and some of them we would see again and some of them we wouldn't. But when they said they were going to expand it, we decided we didn't want to let that happen and tried to stop that expansion without knowing very much really about this corporation and how this multinational corporation that's very powerful. But one of the first things we noticed is that we weren't the only ones who didn't know anything about the detention center. Most of the people living within a mile of the center had no idea what it was, because it's called GEO Processing Center and it's located in a warehouse district. So a lot of people had no idea that it wasn't just another warehouse or just another industrial business in the area of town. So we started by really doing a lot of door knocking and flyering in the neighborhood to let people know what was happening. We started making connections through having monthly vigils outside the detention center with folks who had loved ones inside. And then we began to hear the complaints that so many of my colleagues have already talked about, really the abuses, documenting the abuses, the lack of healthcare, the overuse of solitary confinement, the lack of calories for people who are grown adults, how cold the facilities are kept. And even back then, we consistently saw contagious outbreaks within the facility that could have been prevented. So even though we're now talking about the last 4 years of the Trump administration and a pandemic, really these problems were already endemic in detention centers across the country. So I would say our first big milestone was when we were able to turn out enough people to encircle that entire center. In a vigil and drums so loud that people could hear us inside. And since then, we've educated the public here in Colorado pretty widely about the center. We've been able to get our congressional delegation up to speed on the harmful impacts of the center. With our partners, we've been able to pass some local and state legislation that helps us have more transparency. So it's not such a black hole when people are detained inside the facility. And what we're seeking now is accountability and the release of all the people who are detained there. But it's been a very long and sometimes not so pretty journey of organizing to get to this place that we're at now. And I think there are a lot of detention centers around the country that are rural and remote, or that are right in the middle of an urban area like ours, that people have no idea what's happening or how it works, that people end up there. So it's really great that there are folks who are newer to learning about detention centers on the call today. That's where we were just a little over 10 years ago.
Thanks, Piper, for sharing. And yeah, like you said, it's something that is under our noses. It's something that is funded by our tax dollars. It's something that is justified. But what I've definitely seen is that over the past years, people are realizing how much power they have to, to interrupt those decisions and that cycle of harm and hurt that we keep seeing inflicted on communities because of these detention facilities. So I'm going to move on. We spoke about the pandemic, right? Like knowing that pre the pandemic, these detention centers have always had issues. During the pandemic, the risks in detention centers and similar carceral facilities multiplied exponentially. The nature of confinement, as we know, it makes it impossible for people to practice social distancing. Piper spoke about the increased use of solitary confinement to punish people who spoke out while they were in detention centers. And inadequate health care, like Leticia shared about, and limited sanitation really helped COVID-19 spread. In fiscal year 2020 alone, which was from September 2020, 21 people died in ICE custody, and that was the highest death rate in 15 years. And that just showed how terrible things were, but also the fact that it's the norm that we anticipate that there will be a number of people dying every year in detention centers because we know how terrible these facilities are. And so as the pandemic hit, a number of our colleagues around, partner organizations, we're hearing from people inside detention centers concerned about their safety. And so advocates rallied together under a cry, free them all. And for folks who joined earlier on, you were able to see a snippet of the videos of some of the organizing we did across the country with advocates who are also working to decarcerate from carceral facilities that are not for immigrants. So jails, prisons, and more. Some of these efforts were successful, and we'll hear a little bit about them, some not so much. But the reality is that it's because of the established work, the decades of organizing, the years of relationship building and coalition building, right, that we got some gains, that we were able to even pull together resources to make this rally call, right? So Jordan, as a detention attorney in Newark at that time, can you share a bit about the learnings from the advocacy during the Free Them All moment that is still going on now, that you all leaned on to push the demand, but you also learned from that experience?
One thing we learned, COVID was a very scary time for everyone, but especially people who were detained, if you can imagine, with no one knowing what was going on, how dangerous it was, which turned out to be very dangerous, or when there was much less information. And I remember at that time hearing and seeing people post on social media how they were trying to spend all their newfound free time. And our team was just working some of us 100-hour weeks trying to get people out. And so I could not relate with that at all. But there were significant gains we made. The community really came together and rallied. Our organization filed in partnership with other regional organizations a class action lawsuit under the umbrella of Free Them All. And we did that in conjunction with community organizers and pushed really for releases of everyone and not just our individual clients. There were people hunger striking on the inside. There were community members protesting on the outside. It was a really vibrant moment. And it plays well into, I think, our beliefs as an organization that legal services aren't enough. At least it's hard for me sometimes to recognize that as a lawyer, but it's true because we could get everyone in detention a lawyer, which they don't have. But even if we accomplish that our goal, we're still going to have these oppressive institutions and we're still going to have the bad immigration law that won't be affected by that. So I think we were happy to be part of this lawsuit in coalition with organizers in New Jersey, and we'll move forward, keep trying to do campaigns like that.
Thanks, Jordan, for sharing that. And that key reflection, right? Like, it's more than just getting everyone a lawyer, and it's part and parcel of the broader campaign. Make sure folks have their due process, but as well make sure that we don't have to keep doing this again. You know, Serge shared briefly about how the organization, like your community, has grown, you know, as many lawyers and organizers, but that just shows that this system is growing and that we are getting more people on board to fight it. But we're hopeful that in the coming years, our teams will be shrinking because we would have solved, you know, this issue of detention and move on to something else, world poverty maybe, to go solve. But I want to hear briefly from Pedro. You know, Jordan said something about people on the inside, folks who are currently detained, also, you know, protesting and organizing as we were organizing on the outside. What happened in California around the Free Them All call to action?
Yeah, thank you, Penel. And so what we witnessed is that there was natural organic organizing that was taking place inside the Otay Mesa Detention Center. And this was also taking place in other detention centers across the state of California, and as others have mentioned, across the United States. Our work here in San Diego meshed very nicely and naturally with some of the organizations on the ground, like the Otay Mesa Detention Resistance, which then later morphed into a local coalition called the Free Them All San Diego Coalition, which incorporated a lot of the grassroots organizations that were pushing forward in separate and sometimes connected ways their work to free people from immigration detention. What we saw, though, is that oftentimes when we were able to organize events outside of the Otay Mesa Detention Center, the agents that were guarding the facility were then reacting in such a way where they would be violent against people that were detained inside the facility by not allowing them to have their breaks, by not permitting them to make the phone calls to family or to friends, and so on and so forth. When we saw the outbreak of the pandemic, as Leticia mentioned, they were not receiving the proper PPE equipment, and so many of them then cut the sleeves from the shirts in order to create their own face masks. As a result, the Otay Mesa Detention Facility guards responded by firing some sort of chemical agent at some of their organizers and then placing some of their organizers into solitary confinement. And so this went on for a while. What we attempted to do following the death of Carlos Escobar Mejia, who was the first person to die under ICE custody, and that took place here at the Otay Mesa Detention Center, is we attempted to deliver 1,000 face masks with the assistance of one of the state representatives. Unfortunately, the Otay Mesa Detention Facility did not accept the face masks, even though we knew at that time that people who were detained, who had been hunger striking, who had been organizing internally, were not being provided with the right type of equipment. And there was a possibility that more people were getting ill and that more people would eventually die. And so I really want to highlight here the organic nature of the organizing that took place inside that really allowed for groups such as ours and other grassroots groups to be guided on how to do and conduct our organizing efforts outside to support their calls for action internally.
Thanks for sharing, Pedro. And just really horrific to just hear how these systems and the agents of these systems are responding to folks just trying to exercise their human rights and protect themselves from a virus that we were all trying to protect ourselves from outside here. So I want to move on a little bit to this conversation around closing detention centers, right? We know that it's more than just getting somebody out. We know that it's more than just providing a lawyer. A huge part of our work, right, is ending detention. And so that means closing a detention center, getting people due process, their due process rights, as well as making sure that we pass policies that shrink the current detention system, as well as stop the expansion of the current detention system. And it seems like I'm saying the same thing twice, but it's actually quite different when you look at how this system works. And so why is it important to do that? Why is it important to not just stop at providing a lawyer? And I would like to hear from Piper first on this, and then we can also hear from Serge and or Jordan of what is happening in Newark. So Piper, why is it important to go further than just getting people released from detention centers or closing a detention center? Why are they all part of the puzzle? You're off mute. Yeah, you're good.
Sorry, I realized. It's okay. So one of the things that I think has been really important for us over our journey, like I had mentioned before, of being involved with and trying to draw attention to the conditions in detention and really the fact that detention isn't needed in the first place, that people, when they're not detained, when they're not on ankle monitors, when they're not part of any surveillance, they show up to court at really high rates, higher than any other court system we have in the US. So first of all, it's just not needed. Second of all, as we documented people's experiences in detention and the abuses that they were suffering, the way that impacted their family, the loss of their income, the loss of their presence, we had a really healthy debate within the immigrant community and as organizers about whether we should be organizing to close these facilities or not. And some of the first early years of this movement really were looking at restricting who's detained and improving conditions. And what we've seen over the last decade is that those efforts don't change people's experiences, that our government has not been successful in holding these facilities accountable or improving conditions over an entire decade of many, many people across the country working very closely together. Second of all, we used to have concerns about people being moved far away. Our detention center is the only one in a many hundreds of miles radius. And if we close this facility, would people just be shipped further away? And what the members of our group, the Not One More Table, have said is, if it means that less people are detained, and if it means that this is one of the steps that we need to take in order to end this system, we're willing to take that risk. And we've actually been organizing with people in other states whose folks are sent here who don't have detention centers anymore, but it's way less people that ICE can detain because there's less centers for them to do it in. And it also, again, continues to raise the profile of how unnecessary this is. And at the end of the day, the only reason we're detaining people is because they lack that piece of paper. And I think for us, the fundamental question of whether that's the right thing to do, whether that violates people's human rights and their right to freedom, the answer is yes, it does violate those rights. And so the centers absolutely have to close. And I think that's been our journey here locally to getting to an abolitionist place around these centers, and also exploring similar policies at jails and prisons locally, because there's a lot of parallels as well.
Thanks, Piper. And I'm just going to point it to Serge a little bit because, a question in the chat is about what happens when a detention center closes down or is shut down locally. You spoke briefly about the New Jersey's legislation to pass a bill that prohibits new detention centers, as well as extensions or renewals of detention contracts. And so like Piper said, we want to reduce the number of facilities so that they detain less people. Is that the same thing that's happening with that legislation? What are the other goals for the legislation that was passed in New Jersey?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think, in the process of making a new law, you have to negotiate. You have to write it down and make sure that you have the support. We were able to get to that bill because we had a lot of negotiation and making sure that it can at least pass the vote. And as someone who studied political science, the best way to change the way society functions is to make sure that we create new rules. That's how you build a society. That's the ultimate way to make policy change. That's how they call it. Policy change, the key. Because when you have that policy change, you can be said that, yes, we've achieved this. And then from that point, build also going forward. So, we've adopted the Attorney General directives. They were all directives trying to guide the police on the way they should behave. And we realized that it was insufficient, that we may want to turn into a law. And then we decided to introduce a new bill with the partners, with local partners, with some legislators, which is going to be called the Values Act. There's already a draft out there. The Values Act basically codifies some of these issues into a law. And there are some issues regarding especially, the way our local police behaves. For example, our local police may, act upon receiving an immigration warrant. And there's a clear difference between an immigration warrant and a judicial warrant. And basically, we don't see an immigration warrant as a document at all that can give someone a right to detain someone. So, and these are some of the steps that we have to go through to make sure we break down that system piece by piece. And we absolutely believe in New Jersey that detention is the nexus of the immigration system in America. If they have less bed, like Piper just said, it is going to, it's going to affect the capacity of ICE to operate, because the more bed they have, they can, put in place the logistics system to fly people from this location to another location. And they can also expand, we can reduce at least the way money is flowing into our county and totally affecting the local governance. So there are so many issues that have at the heart, the detention system. When you knock that system down, you're going to understand that it's going to be a big piece that's going to basically have that's some reverberating effect on all other dimensions of immigration system in America.
Thanks, Serge. Jordan, I just want to quickly check in with you, because as you're doing this deportation, detention, defense, right? You are advocating for people to be released, right? Or if you're advocating for someone who's in a detention center that's going to be closed, what does that mean then for your advocacy to ask that they don't be transferred, like Piper said, 100 miles further away from their community than they already are?
This is a big thing for me because we're in the middle of detention center closures in New Jersey, which is a hard-won victory after years of sustained pressure against our officials and organizing. And it is a victory and it is great, but there's also realities that we're dealing with, which is people being transferred out of state and from their lawyers and their families, and other hard things that come with that. And it naturally brings up the question, which the framing I got from a report from the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, which put out a report in 2019 after a detention center closure in California. Do the advantages of closure outweigh the difficulties for family and legal representatives? And there's a lot of nuance in it, but the report also does anecdotally point to less ICE enforcement actions in their local area. It creates lots of opportunities for release. All eyes really need to be on ICE in the wake of a detention center closure, because ICE likes to pretend that their hands are tied. They only have to transfer people, but it couldn't be farther from the truth. ICE has discretion to release anyone at any moment, and there's nothing stopping them except that they don't want to. And so people do get released in detention center closures locally that wouldn't otherwise, is my belief. And I want to share with you an idea called just closure, which is, I heard it first from Detention Watch Network, and I'm not sure where it came from, but it's the idea that when a community comes together to pressure officials to close down a detention center, it kind of carries over the responsibility of those community members to have a plan for communications, for when people are transferred, sticking with them, providing support to their families, making sure they still have legal representation where they're going, and having all those pieces in place as much as possible. And again, I don't know the right answer to the question I posed earlier, but I do know if we're taking leadership from directly affected persons and they're saying that this is what they want, and they see shutting down detention centers individually is the way we're going to chip away at detention nationwide, because so far we haven't had the right response from the administration. Even like going back to Obama, detention is just growing. And so if we're taking our cues from them and this is what they want, then absolutely, as someone who has had clients transferred and knows, at least from a perspective of representing them and the additional challenges it closes, I'm still willing to participate and contribute to the fight to shut down local detention centers as much as possible.
Thanks, Jordan. And just seeing some comments in the chat as well as questions. Anthony asked, are these detention centers public or private? So generally, for-profit corporations actually run 2/3 of all immigrant detainees in publicly funded detention centers. They house 2/3 of these detainees. In California, 5 detention centers are run by GEO Corporation. In San Diego, the particular detention center that Pedro has spoken about, Otemisa, is run by CoreCivic. In New Jersey, the Elizabeth Detention Center is also run by CoreCivic. And in Colorado, where Piper has been sharing about, is run by GEO. And so these for-profit detention centers also determine the kind of detention and deportation policies we see in the United States. And so campaigning against them really is more than just campaigning against a detention center, but you're campaigning against a corporation. And so you have to begin to look at tactics that affect things like who are the stockholders, because GEO has stock on the market. They're actually not just profiting, but they're conscripting everyone else to come and profit from the warehousing of immigrants. And so you see it's a nuance there around, it's more than just a detention center, but how are we over-relying on the warehousing of individuals? And so, Serge, this is a quick question for you, right? It's clear, right, that the greatest impact of dismantling ICE's detention system is the result of communities working together to reject the targeting and jailing of their loved ones, and to also reject the establishments of detention centers or the expansion of detention centers in their communities. We've seen strides. You've spoken about laws being passed in New Jersey, in Maryland, in Washington State. We've seen contracts being closed, contracts being ended. Are these wins being reflected at the national level in the advocacy that we're seeing? That is the federal government doing the right thing is essentially the gist of the question, right?
Well, Peniel, I mean, you are in DC, so that should be a question for you. But what I can say is that forums like the one we're having right now is to share the information across the country about things that we're doing and share best practices. And I think that's our best way to really say we can do this. I mean, you're talking about Maryland, we have Washington State. These are, and we've talked about the closure of jails in California. These are examples. In New Jersey, we have not completely done it outright because the law we're passing is going to allow some pending contracts being out there. So again, these are steps that we need to take. And I believe all states are different. All the counties are different. And we've tried to make sure that we use our local access to some of our politicians, to all our coalition members to push back. Because I would not tell you that I have a recipe on how we can do it, let's say in the South, because that's a different ball game there. How are they going to do in Louisiana? But the key thing is to put out this big message that we are not going anywhere, and continue to push at this local, like I said, at the city level, township level, county level, and state level, because this is where the big battle is. For a very long time, we thought it was all an immigration matter. In fact, even our county folks our county elected officials and state elected officials are going to tell you that it's a fair matter. But when we look up close over the years, we realize that it was all embedded into our local communities. Because when we have that 287G contract, it's the county, people who are we elected, who are allowing that to happen. So the key question is, we have to start this fight at the local level. And we're going to reach the climax by bringing everything at a point where we're going to see that we've reached the climax. We've tackled maybe 20 different states. And now, across the board, people are going to understand that it's time to switch the code.
Thanks, Serge. I think that's important. And for folks who are wondering what the 287G is, this is a contract that essentially allows its ICE agents have county jails hold immigrant detainees before they move them to an ICE facility. And so those contracts are signed at local levels across the country, and they can be canceled, right? They do not have to be signed. Like Serge said, it's an optional thing. You can decide to have it be part of your community or not. And as Serge said, I'm here in DC and I'm seeing how, quite frankly, the federal government is way, way, way behind in the strides that the local communities are making, like the local elected officials are making. In the early 2010s, AFSC ran a campaign to end what we called the immigration detention quota. Because then when Congress was writing funding bills, they required ICE to maintain 34,000 beds in immigration detention centers every day. This was a requirement. And so that just showed you, like, regardless of whether ICE had anybody or nobody to detain, it gave them carte blanche to detain as many people as possible because they were given a blank check of up to 34,000 people to be detained. In writing, this stopped, right? But what we've seen is something different. A number of our colleagues here, including Piper, Pedro, Serge, we are part of what we call the Defund Hate Coalition, which is a coalition of multiple organizations advocating for Congress to cut the funding to ICE and CBP because their budgets are ballooned, right? And so someone had asked the question of, like, is Biden expanding detention or is he not allowing people to be released? It's more than a Biden thing. It's more than a Trump thing. It's more than an Obama thing. When the president puts out a budget requesting funding for detention for the incarceration of 32,500 people per day in immigration detention, including 2,500 beds for family detention, because they are anticipating a quote unquote surge at the border. For folks that they can actually process and put in community-based alternatives, but they're instead relying on the infrastructure that they've spent years building and tons of dollars being poured into that. And this is more than double the number of people that were in detention when Biden came into office. Because of the pandemic and because of some of the successes of the Freedom All campaign, we saw reduced numbers in detention centers. And in the past 4 or 5 months, we've seen those numbers almost double. What's worse is that Congress then sees Biden's budget request, kind of tweaks it a little bit, but really doesn't do anything to change it, especially the demands we've been making of them. Congress is proposing that they fund detention averages of 28,500 people on a daily basis. Put in money of about $2.4 billion into custody operations. And so when, New Jersey is signing these, canceling these contracts, when San Diego is moving away from detaining people or becoming a sanctuary city, when we see these pro-freedom, anti-detention policies at the local level, but then the government is saying, well, we're still sending you $2.4 billion. The question then is, of course, these agencies will want to incarcerate, will want to detain people. And so that's what we're seeing at that level. So while steps have been taken to promote this, to promote alternatives, we're still relying heavily on this sort of this system because we are ingrained and invested, unfortunately, in the profit margins there. So Pedro, this is a question for you, especially as an advocate of communities at the border. Every year, the government wastes about $23 billion on jailing, deporting immigrants, militarizing your community. And as part of the Defund Hate Coalition, not only are we calling for cuts, but we're calling for an investment, right, in our communities and what we need. Can you share briefly what cuts the border communities are calling for, as well as the investments that they would like to be seen in their communities as well?
And I think that's a great question, given the context of the pandemic in which we live. And so if we see, for instance, the treatment of migrants inside detention centers and the fact, as Leticia pointed out at the beginning, that they weren't being provided with the proper equipment to care for themselves, to be safe, then that forces a question of for what purpose are people being detained? And then when we get into the question of the profit margin, then we arrive at the answer that these companies are profiting off of human suffering, and their primary care isn't really of the human beings that they are locking up in their facilities, but it's about how they can make the biggest profit margin off of detaining human beings. And so, and we can make the same comparison with, as you mentioned, Penel, the militarization of border communities, and how we've seen in the past that there has been a lot of money directed to the construction of needless border walls, to the infrastructure of ensuring that there are enough boots on the ground to respond to a supposed crisis or surge of people. When we start looking at those numbers, we realize where the real crisis is the fact that this government isn't responding to people who are seeking safety from harm in a humanitarian way. And the response then has been, how do we ensure that there are enough beds to lock as many people up in order to ensure that we're still continuing to meet our profit margin that we expect to make? So what we would like to see is rescinding some of the policies that still remain from Trump's administration, namely the CDC's Title 42 order. But along with that, ensuring that funding that would be used to detain people is actually used to accept people, create the infrastructure to accept people in a humanitarian way that doesn't degrade their basic human dignity. We still have not seen that that commitment from the Biden administration. In fact, the response has been, when we say that essential travel isn't the only sort of travel that can take place across borders, we're going to have to create the conditions where people are going to be detained in these facilities. And we're seeing that in the conversations taking place around the budget and Biden's budget, and we see Congress's response to that. So that's extremely concerning, as well as, we have seen that, I should backtrack and say, we have seen some Band-Aid fixes. So the changing policy about people who are pregnant shouldn't be detained in such a way. However, egregious rights violations occur for everyone. So we shouldn't, as advocates, plainly accept that this is something that is a good thing on a face value, given that so many people are facing these tremendous situations where they're practically losing their lives, and some of them have. And so that's why the call to free them all is unconditional, because we're saying free them all because all of these individuals are subjected to this degrading treatment that could not only violate their basic human rights, but also could lead them to lose their lives.
Thanks, Pedro. So at the moment, we're seeing the Biden administration lean into what we've been calling for, what people call alternatives to detention, a narrative that many in this movement continue to push by saying that we can welcome people with dignity. We do not have to warehouse them. We do not have to spend money detaining them. However, I feel like there's a clear difference between what we would call for when we say alternatives to detention versus what the Biden administration or any other administration is willing and able to put forward. Piper, do you want to share briefly what AFSC means when we call for alternatives to detention? And I'd also like to hear briefly from Jordan as well, if she has anything to add on, given as she's one who will be advocating for these opportunities for folks who are detained.
Yeah, so I think first I would just like to say a little piece about what the Biden administration means by alternatives to detention, and not just Biden, but his predecessors as well. They mean surveillance and ankle monitoring, which are also run by the same corporations that run for-profit detention centers. BI's Incorporated is owned by GEO, and they're the ones who do most of the ankle monitoring and surveillance for ICE when people are released from detention. And these alternatives are really problematic because they shame people, they criminalize people, they shackle them. If you've never been on an ankle monitor, most of these ankle monitors require you to be plugged into a wall for big portions of the day to charge it. And it also talks to you. So if this corporation can talk to you through the device while you're like sitting around with your kids. So they're very, it sounds maybe not that big of a deal if you haven't had much contact with them, but they're very dehumanizing to use. And so what we're talking about when we talk about community alternatives or community approaches, it's really about focusing on supporting the individual and accessing resources and their rights. There are both formal and informal ways that this is happening across the country and in Colorado right now. So what we see is programs that really connect people to pro bono lawyers or to low bono lawyers, make sure that people understand the basic expectations of them in the court system and are able to access relief that they're eligible for under the law, but they might not have explained to them by ICE or by the attorney for ICE if they didn't have a lawyer. So these community organizations provide those supports. But then they also provide support for folks who are newer to the country, who maybe came seeking asylum and who maybe don't have family members in this country. They provide a lot of support connecting folks to their communities from countries of origin, connecting folks to basic resources, housing and food, getting integrated into our local communities and being able to participate in civic life with us. And those community alternatives work. People do show up to court, they do feel supported, they feel connected, and they have more success in navigating and beginning to overcome some of the trauma that they've experienced through migrating, through being detained, through the process, any trauma that they might have faced in their country of origin, particularly asylum seekers. So these community groups and volunteer groups play a really key role and cost much less and really benefit our local communities in a way that the detention centers don't. And so that's what we're calling for, a vision where people can access the right to migrate without being detained first and foremost. But then if people are detained and they're released, really these community supports being the go-to thing over a detention model and a profit model. I don't know, Jordan, if you have something you would like to add to.
I just agree about some of the things you said about how much harm electric monitoring causes the people who wear them. In Spanish, we call them grilletes, which I think translates to shackle. And a report just came out this week by, I think Freedom for Immigrants was one of the organizations who put it out. They did like a large scale survey talking about some of the mental health and physical effects of these things, and they're really awful. I have a 19-year-old client from Honduras who just got released on one, and something I never thought about is he's like, I can't play soccer now. And like, what does a 19-year-old boy from Honduras wants to do? He like wants to play soccer, not to generalize too much. But that really hit me. I think it's scary how anecdotally, I feel like use of these things has really increased since I've gotten involved in this work. I think that it doesn't mean that they're releasing more or less people. I just think it means that the people they're releasing are getting more of this electronic monitoring. So we have to be careful when asking, we have to be careful what we ask for. And again, I think how we define alternatives to detention, I hadn't really thought about that before, but like this isn't it. And I like, Piper, the different alternatives that you proposed. And I think we should push that narrative as much as we can.
Thanks, Jordan and Piper, for sharing that. So as we wrap up this conversation, I just want to hear from each of our panelists, right? There are people on the call who said they've never engaged in any kind of immigration detention work before, either, supporting families and communities or advocating against detention. And some folks are organizers. They're part of community organizers. I'd like for you to share 2 tips, right? For folks who've never done this work before, where do they start? Where do they look to join ongoing efforts? And for folks who are doing this work, what would you encourage people to do? In particular, lean into who are the unlikely allies you found in this work, right? When we did our Freedom Hall campaign, we did a lot of organizing alongside individuals who are advocating for decarceration and ending to mass incarceration policies and reforming the criminal legal system as we know it. So those were some allies that we joined forces with. So sharing within those themes, who are your unlikely allies that you would recommend people really work with and build relationships with as they start out this work or as they continue it? And for folks who are not sure where to go, where do they start from? So we'll start with Pedro on that.
I think first and foremost is to center folks that are detained and to be in contact with their families. Because ultimately, at least from our point of view, is getting direction for those that are most directly impacted and affected. It's how to properly lead a campaign that ultimately will result in their liberation. And then secondly is identify your allies. Find out who might already be doing this work. Tap into their resources, reach out to them so that you're not duplicating efforts, but you're aligning yourself with the values that other folks are doing that also speak to your values in protecting and defending basic human rights.
Thanks, Pedro. Serge?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pernille. That's a very important question. I usually like to say that you have to find a place in your heart for this issue, because if you don't have a place in your heart for immigrants, it's less likely you're going to find yourself in the space where these issues are being discussed. And then when you have that place in your heart, the next thing is get to know the people that you're seeking to protect, because we're not just talking about ICE in the air. We talk about ICE too much and we tend to forget the people who are affected by the ICE policy. So make sure that those people are at the heart of your fight, of your own search to see how it can be relevant in this conversation. And obviously, I mean, if you find a way to have access to join, let's say, this webinar today, I would say this was an amazing step for you. Are you already in? You can say that some of the main issues that are occurring right now. You could see that this is something that there's a lot to learn about, and these are things that you're going to continue digging on your own through Facebook. There are tons of groups out there, real stuff about the jails that are out there. I'm sure you can find resources that can list you all the jails that are across the country. I mean, ICE has a website for that. So learn about that, learn about community, and you're going to be ready for any rally coming up. And go to rallies, of course.
Thanks, Serge. Piper?
Yeah, I just want to re-emphasize what Pedro and Serge said about finding ways to connect with people who are directly impacted. One of the ways that we did that was flyering and tabling outside the detention center and just talking with people. But there are lots of other ways. There are a lot of organizations that visit people in detention or write letters to them. There are organizations that help raise bond money for people who are detained so that they can get out as quickly as possible and keep fighting their case. So there are a lot of different ways to connect with people who are impacted by detention. That is definitely the first step. And then the other thing that I would say in conjunction with them is really documenting everything that you hear and helping to notice the categories of abuse that people are experiencing, really tracking, not sharing that without people's permission, but starting to track what you're hearing inside that detention center if no one else is organizing there. And then being bold and committed to the long haul, I think are big requirements. There's a lot of tension between helping the individual and trying to close down these centers, and you have to be able to hold that tension the whole time you're doing this work. Make sure you're doing both things. And then the very last thing I'll say is don't let your congressional representative off the hook for these detention centers. They're the ones that sign the checks, and they need to stop signing them.
Jordan, any addition for folks who maybe might be aspiring attorneys as well?
I wasn't prepared for that question, but I was prepared to answer in terms of first steps for someone who's not involved at all. The ideal is, I think, joining your local community efforts. And I also know that that can be difficult. And so, like, you know, taking even a step back and just finding stuff online to plug into. Like, I'm pretty like hyper. I was able to tell you about all those links just because I'm a part of like a million like Facebook groups and listservs and like Twitter and like all the things. So just getting plugged in and start to like find out what's going on, and then maybe that can like lead you toward where your role could be. And I believe that there's a role for everyone. I've called upon people in my community for like various things, to pick clients up from the detention center when they get released, because there's like no one else. Just there's so many roles and there's not really time to get into it all, but just know that there's a role for you. In terms of unlikely allies, I've been surprised in New Jersey by the gains we've made with officials and legislatures. I've never done that type of work before, but I see their effects. I see with the trust directive that large amounts of people are never in detention. The only people that are in detention are the people in like the so-called carve-outs, which is like a very small category of people, which even though it's not perfect, it means it's working. And the state of New Jersey has been funding our universal representation program and increasing the funding every year. And so I think right now, like the local fights are where it's at. I really believe that.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you all so much for sharing just your tips, your tricks, where you go to for your resources. And like Piper said, the fact that you need to be in this in the long haul, knowing that you need to be on the right side of history and just, you know, impacting, you know, lives and community members in different ways. So I'm going to wrap this up now, and we're going to hear from our director of our migration program here at AFSC, who's going to close us out with some key calls to action. And then for folks who are still on, which is a huge number of people, we're going to do a brief breakout room session here where you just get to meet some other folks that have joined this call. Ask any quick questions of AFSC staff that you were not able to ask on the general call, and then we'll be done. So thank you for staying and hanging in with us. I know it's getting late in a lot of places. So I'm just going to turn it to Kristen now. Kristen?
Great. Thank you so much, Panel. And thanks everyone for being with us tonight. What an incredibly powerful panel and just a lot of incredible reflections. So I just first want to say thank you so much to Leticia for sharing your story, to Pedro and Serge, Jordan and Piper for being with us tonight and for sharing with us the years and decades of your experience. And to Panel for facilitating. Thank you so much, Panel, for keeping us moving together tonight. I also just again want to say thanks to the rest of you for being here. I was so moved at the beginning of the range of experience that you all have, and for those of you who said you, the 10% of you who for whom this is one of the first things you've done detention, thank you for being here. To those of you who've been activists for years and decades, we're so grateful for your ongoing work. The panelists have already said it. So many of the ways that we can take action together, I think, are anchored in what it means to just find, as Sarah says, to find a space in your heart to care so deeply about this that you don't stop working on this until every person is free. I think for all of us, like, I hope that you will be moved by the stories you've heard tonight. I hope you'll be so moved that you will like go to Facebook and share this video with other people in your community and your family and your congregation, to your friends, and just say, listen to these stories and what can we do then? And so as you've heard from our panelists, please connect with those in your community who are already doing this work. If you aren't already connected to immigrant rights organizations who are standing with people who are detained and their family members, great place to start. Other allied-based organizations. And then we have such a chance to do advocacy together. There are multiple links in the chat. So please, before you get off of Facebook or Zoom tonight, please just go ahead and click on those and contact your members of Congress and your governors and let them know that this is a time for us to end detention and to free them all. We hope that you'll continue to connect with AFSC in the weeks and months to come, as we know that Congress is making critical decisions about the amount of money that is going towards detention and enforcement in our communities. And this is a time to say enough, and a time to say we need you to instead invest that money in our communities so that all of us can live with dignity. So please continue to connect with us and look for more opportunities to do that on AFSC's Facebook page. And we do hope you'll just stay right now and go into a breakout room for a debrief, because this is a great chance for you just to share your own stories and what's on your heart tonight, and to continue to share the message that we all have a chance, as Jordan said, each of us has a role to play in freeing all folks from detention. So thanks everyone for being here tonight, and please stay so we can go into our breakouts together.